Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomorec.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, part 3 of our Firstfruits series in the Epistle of James. Welcome back to the No More Sea broadcast. We're going to continue with one of our older series and bring back and rediscover, tying in many of the concepts that we have overlaid throughout this entire channel. So it's been a while since we visited this, so I encourage you to listen to parts 1 and 2, which actually in both of those I have constantly referred back to other material on our channel. So new listeners that aren't familiar with all that may find some of these concepts a little difficult to understand simply because we've covered so much ground on this channel that you need all that background to help you understand. But we did 2 parts on the first fruits. So in part 1, we focused on the Hebrew word in Genesis 1:1, and we went back to that in the beginning idea, and we've done a lot about the beginning and end and this whole cycle of things. In part 2, we focused then on the Greek term used in the Greek translation in the Septuagint in part 2, and we focused how it's from the beginning that we understand our end. And we, think about an archer who has his bow and arrow, and he's looking at his target, but then you got to follow that arrow and its trajectory, and it's going to begin with the archer, and then the archer is going to sight his target, and the pathway from the bow to the target to hit its target, what's going on there, and it needs to take. And obviously in the first 2 videos we talked about how one can get off track, and that's certainly the case for today. We need to remember that about how things can get off track and how they need to get back on track. And we talk about the cycles and patterns of cycles that the Bible begins with in the beginning, creation, and how that pattern of new creation keeps happening as uncreation occurs throughout, or decreation occurs throughout the biblical narrative. And you constantly have this idea, just like a day goes through its cycle, and we start our day out, brand new day in the morning when we get up, and then it ends at night. And we talked about how this is tied directly to our series in the Firstborn, and how the Greek word ties into the idea of the powers. And so in the beginning at creation, according to Job 38, you have the powers present. The divine council is present. C.S. Lewis has them depicted, like Job, as a choir singing during creation. And obviously the language of Genesis is lends itself to that, being exalted prose to the point that it's almost poetic, but it's something entirely different. And so you have this concept then that you're trying to deal with. And if you're talking about a son becomes, as firstborn, is the person that's going to be the heir, that's going to get the double portion and the responsibility to take over when the father dies. So when the father dies, that represents an end. And out of that end, the son then begins to become the patriarch of the family. He begins his journey as the father. And so you have this language then where son replaces father, and where this idea in creation and these cycles is a constant cycle. And so many of the Bible is full of genealogies where we have all this talk of son of son of son of son of son of. We have these cycles of life, the circle of life, where one life ends, and that, king ends his rule, often by death. The king ends his rule, and then the king's son, the prince, takes over that and becomes the king again. And so you have this idea of a king dying, the end, and a new beginning with a new king being the son. And so the Son takes over. So the Son replaces his Father in this cycle or circle. And the whole idea of being made in the image of God and how that comes down to us mirroring what's going on in heaven here upon the earth. And so we talk a lot about the prophets and how they went up, and through various means they ascended up into the divine council, and they were privy to the divine council through participation in heaven. And then they come down and they bring heaven's rule down upon the earth, and they reflect the rule of heaven upon the earth, and they begin to denounce those things that are incorrect, the injustices that are taking place upon the earth, because humans have chosen to get off track from their target. They have diverted from. They're in sin because they're off what God intended. They have moved off the proper telos into something else. They're not filling the whole earth with God's glory, being vessels of glory, being glorified in their participation with the Father in making the whole earth his kingdom and its rule. No, they have diverted and gone to something else. And so the prophets bring heaven's rule back and remind us of what God intended, and brings God's spoken word, and they embody that as God's messengers. As they embody God's glory, they embody God's message, and they challenge the people then to embody God's message and become that word incarnate like Jesus. And Jesus obviously is the greatest embodiment of what it means to be God, but at the same time is what it means to be human, as humans are made in the image of God, to rule, to be like the powers, and to bring about God's righteous justice, his reign upon the earth, so that all is made right. Every mountain is brought down low, and every valley is raised up, and you have this coming together of heaven and earth as one. That's depicted in Isaiah, in the latter chapters of Isaiah and the latter chapters of the book of Revelation that model and mimic that. And so we're tying all that together, and we're trying to understand that what it means to rule as God's imagers and image God on the earth. And this idea then that slowly you have the idea of Adam is the earth. He's an earthling that has God's life, breath within him. God takes the earth and breathes his life and makes it from earth to earthling. And he is crowned, according to the Psalm, following the Becker-Legg dissertation from Harvard, that the idea behind being an imager is being that idol, that image, that idol, that slum, that then reflects God's rule upon the earth in this realm, to reflect what's going on in heaven with the powers, with those in rulership. And it's all tied to this idea of the head or the chief, or the powers. The king is the head of a nation. He's that ruler, that archon of these certain geography that's laid out in his kingdom. Just as a father is the ruler, as a patriarch of his family. And then when he dies and comes to his end, his son ascends to become the new patriarch and begins the rule of the family as a ruler, as an archon. And so all of this, though, again, go back to all the other videos where we have summarized all that. I'm just trying to sum it all up for you here, and trying to get you to understand what it means to, as humans, to participate in the rule of God upon the earth as his imagers. And we've gone through all that in many videos, and will continue to do so. But so we want to turn now to the book of James, because this idea of first fruits plays heavily in the book of James. And beginning, we'll look at James chapter 1, verse 18. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be kind of first fruits of his creatures. So then in the creation, God has so much going on. And if you read Genesis 1, you have all this stuff. And then when God gets to the end, the crescendo at the very end, it's like, okay, here is the centerpiece. Here's the final, the finale. I create humans, and they're going to rule over it all. And I take my spirit and I put it into something physical, into the earth, something made from the earth. And it carries my presence. It carries my glory. It carries me. It reflects me. It mirrors me. And they're my imagers. But interestingly enough, again, going back to our series, parts 1 and 2 here, and then all the things in parts 1 and 2 that I go back to through Firstborn series and all the other videos, and even our video on the end from the beginning, all those series, just all of that, and participation, we have a whole series on that. All of those things need to come into play here. Because when you get to Genesis chapter 2, we're doing something slightly different. We're kind of backing up, and we're going to retell the story in a different way to try to help you understand what's going on. So instead of it ending with humans, again, this is so majestic in its poetry. Instead of ending with humans, Genesis 2 begins with humans. So it's phenomenal. So again, if you go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, the idea is present there that in the beginning we have a wilderness, a wasteland, and we have a watery mess. And Genesis 1 deals with the water and how God defeats chaos and orders it in an orderly manner. And he makes things out of it just like anyone would take a piece of land and turn it from the jungle or wasteland that it is and turn it into something productive as a garden or a kingdom or a city or whatever, and civilize it and cultivate it and make it into something that's producing and productive instead of wild. But Genesis 2 is the exact opposite. So it's turning everything on its head. It's kind of like Genesis 1 drives through this vision of how God created everything, and then we stop and we back up in reverse and go back through it again, but we're going to do it opposite. And so where Genesis 1 ends with humans, Genesis 2 creation starts with humans, because this is a desert wasteland and God brings water, like Isaiah talks about, rivers in the desert. There's no water, and God brings water, and from that water and from that desert, dirt, jungle, wilderness, he puts the two together and adds a spirit, and out of that he creates humans, and he begins with humans. So humans become the first creation. So they're the first fruits of the firstborn. First in being preeminent, being chief, being head, being the top, being over all. Like the king is the chief human that is ruling a kingdom. And a father, as the patriarch, is the family's ruler. So then you have humans that are first. And they come first chronologically in Genesis chapters 2 story as the first of the creation, but then they're first in sense of, like the king, they're ruling over. So they are in charge of. And that you get that idea from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26, 27, in the image. And what does that mean? Well, 26, 27, 28 describes it. It means dominion, to have rule over, to reflect God's rule in the realm. So he places humans over in charge of. And so here James is grabbing onto that. And this idea of first fruits of all the creations, all the creatures, okay, a kind of, and it's interesting in Genesis, you have this, everything's made according to this kind, its likeness, and yet humans are in the likeness, or what kind? In the kind of likeness of like God. Each seed according to its kind, and humans are according to its kind, being something that has God's breath and life. And they reflect that in the rule, because also, the idea of God's life is in animals too, to some extent. but they don't rule. Animals don't rule. So there's a distinction made there where humans are like God. That's their seed. And they're made in his image. And then Adam passes on his image to his son, and his son is made in his likeness. Well, Adam and Eve are made in God's image. And then Adam and Eve have sons that are in God's image. And that keeps on carrying. So you see this idea of likeness and the image or icon that travels from Genesis 1 through Genesis 5 and Genesis 9 and carries on, that this imaging is still there, and this idea of whenever things end, we have a new beginning, we have a new season. After winter comes the spring, and then we have the summer and we have the harvest. And so you constantly have this cyclical language where the father dies and the son takes over and becomes the new father, the new patriarch. So James 1:18 is kind of tying into that, and Firstfruits again has in the Greek this idea of arche. So, arche. So we have this idea here in James. So let's roll back up, and go. James begins in verse 4. We can't hit all the verses, or we would never finish this. But James chapter 1, verse 4, let steadfastness have its rule and effect, that you may be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. Now, as you know, in what I've produced on this channel, what I argue in my dissertation is that most people, if you don't understand it, that everything was good and humans were good in Genesis 1, but they're not perfect. They don't achieve maturity. And James is targeting that as Christ followers, born of a new creation, what needs to happen? What needs to happen is that we become mature and perfect and complete. And so believers are born into it, just like Adam and Eve were made in the image of God, but they're not perfect. And James is pushing for them to become complete and perfect as Christ was completely human, at the same time completely God. And scholars have noted inside of James this purity language, and how he's not tying it to the ritual purity as much in the Old Testament understanding of the rituals, but he's tying this idea of becoming whole and perfect in the context of the entire general epistles and what they're trying to tie in this participation model. And in the Old Testament, to participate with the divine was to be ritually pure, and James is flipping that and making it out that as Christians we need to be whole and pure in a different sense that's going to model God's kingdom here upon the earth. And we're invited to participate in that paradigm. We never become what Yahweh is, the Trinity is. We're not members of the Trinity, but we are members of the holy ones. We are members of the divine council. We are participating in God's glory to as much extent as we can without becoming members of the Trinity itself, because that's an elite club that's impossible for us to breach, and that's not what the Bible teaches, nor the church. Although there may be some false heretical teachings. So we're maintaining that line. But we are understanding that there's an idea here that James is offering. Yeah, skipping on down to chapter 1, verse 6, but let him ask in faith with no doubt, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven by the wind and tossed. And so here we have this idea again. In the beginning was all this water, and God set up boundaries and pushed the waters to the outer limits. And out of that came the dry land, and out of that came humans, and out of that came all the creation. And when the waters return and flood, there's flooding then like Noah's event. That's a symbol of new creation. And it's a symbol of everything ending. And so even in Christian baptism, we are baptized to represent new creation, that the waters cover us over again and we die like Christ. And we're buried in our baptism like Christ, return to the heart of the earth. And it's back to Genesis 1 where the waters cover. And if we cannot disciple ourselves as Christ followers and become Christ disciples, if we cannot maintain discipleship and get rule over the chaos of this world, which James is arguing what to do when the world chaos takes over. James is a reflection, New Testament reflection on chaos, of taming chaos and what happens when chaos comes. Because if you let the waters overflow you, then you're uncreated, you're decreated. You're not like Jesus walking on top of the waters. You are like Peter sinking below, like Jonah sinking below, and you need new creation to get you back up above the waves. So again, go back to my earlier videos on the channel where we cover Jonah and we cover some of these things. We hope you've enjoyed part 3 of our first fruits. Come back for future episodes where we continue to explore first fruits in the Epistle of James. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.